We'll call the meeting to order and open with a pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank everybody for coming tonight. This is the November 7th, 2018 meeting, Planning and Zoning Commission. If you're addressing the commission at any time during the meeting, we ask that you step forward and use the podium and give your name and address, please. Roll call.
Rick Boggs.
Here.
Dustin Epperson.
Here.
Gary Kendall.
Here.
Darren McGowan.
Here.
Randall Ripley.
Here.
Ann Rogers.
Here.
Jerry Truax.
Here.
All present. Moving on the agenda, old business section, we have several items that have been tabled. Is there any update on any of those?
For Miranda Homes, I have not heard anything on that. The Grand Community, ZON 18005, I believe they will be in next month, and that's the same for ZON 17007, the Hunter's Crossing proposal. So those will remain tabled this month, but more than likely they'll be here next month for consideration.
Okay, thank you. All right, that was all the old business. So moving on to number 5, new business. There are 2 items on the agenda, and if there's no objection from the commission members, I'll suggest that we reverse the order. So we start with B, the rezoning application, ZON 18011. I believe we have people in the audience that are interested in that one. So we'll jump into that. Rezoning application ZON 18011. This is Westport Homes for Broadview Commons Phase 1, Sections 1 and 2.
Thank you, sir. Like you said, this is ZON 18011, submitted by Westport Homes, and this is for the Broadmoor Commons subdivision, Phase 1, Sections 1 and 2. They're requesting approval of a revised final development plan that includes changes to the landscaping. You can see here an area map outlining Phase 1, Sections 1 and 2 out here in the yellowish orange. It also does extend up along this boulevard entrance here, and these 2 parcels on the side are zoned commercial but not part of the development. So a little background on Broadmoor Commons. It was originally rezoned to a planned development district in 1999. However, that plan expired due to lack of progress. The preliminary plan for this was approved on May 4th, 2016. That application was ZON 16003. Overall, the subdivision is going to be 274 units. Phase 1 of which, Sections 1 and 2, final plan was approved on January 4th, 2017. Covers 29.8 acres and 54 units. You remember there was a little bit of discussion about this, I believe at the last meeting, or was the meeting before. The public service director at the time did not like trees to be in the right-of-way. So when this final development plan was approved, there was divergence for the trees to be outside the right-of-way, at least 5 to 10 feet outside. And that did give some problems. So in some cases, it's kind of unclear about which tree goes where. Some lots received an impractical amount of trees. For example, we found one, it was lot 11, supposed to receive a total of 8 trees on the lot. And having that many trees on the lot does reduce the amount of available space for building. And it also gives the case that when a new homeowner moves in, they don't like the trees, they could just cut them down. So it's not a sustainable plan. The current public service director does prefer the trees to be within the right-of-way. So staff felt that a revised plan would be beneficial to all parties. So here we have the original approved plan. Right here is lot 11. You can see there's supposed to be 7 trees right here, plus there was a requirement to have 1 tree on trees. Also over here, you can kind of see this tree is right in the middle of that line, so brings begs the question of who gets it. Here we have the revised plan. You can see cleared up the issues here on lot 11. All the trees are now in the right of way in the tree lawn. So with the revised plan that was submitted, the street trees are to be placed at 50-foot intervals. Section 128305A actually requires the street trees to be one for every 30 feet. And in the narrative statement that was supplied by the applicant, they stated that they chose the 50-foot spacing because with the 30 feet, it presents potential conflicts with locations of driveways, signage, streetlights, and mailboxes. Along with this proposal, additional screening was proposed along Reserve A, bordering the commercial site to the north. And with this proposal, there's a total of 174 trees proposed. Here we can look at the original approved plan. The trees are to be here along the commercially zoned property to the north in Reserve A, and the revised plan that shows those proposed landscaping trees, which are to be evergreens. So in the review by the Planning and Zoning Department, we found that 2 of those trees were not previously approved and are not in the approved street tree table that is provided in section 1283-05-01. Those being the Moraine sweet gum and the Redmond American linden trees. In 1283-05-01, there's a requirement that if the developer were to propose any trees that were not in that street tree table, then they would have to provide appropriate documentation to staff to verify that the growing conditions would be acceptable as a street tree. And with that, like I mentioned before, the street trees are proposed to be placed at 50-foot intervals. Again, 1283-05A requires them to be at 30-foot intervals. A divergence would be needed to allow for the 50-foot tree spacing. On the title sheet of the final development plan, note I3 needs to be revised to remove that language that mentioned the original divergence to allow the trees to be outside the right-of-way and in the individual lots. And they also must include a note for that divergence for the 50-foot tree spacing. And along with that, the development text for the final development plan would have to be revised to reflect those changes. We did receive a set of revised plans from Westport responding to these comments. We noticed that they are proposing that the street trees along the right-of-way on the boulevard entrance are proposed to be actually outside of that right-of-way, and they also want to put them outside the right-of-way on reserves A and B along Old Bay Loop. So inside those reserves would be fine, but as far as outside the right-of-way on the boulevard entrance goes, it would not be possible because Westport does not own that property. Here we can look at the boulevard entrance on the approved plan. The street trees are here along inside the right-of-way. And on the revised plan, you can see that they are actually outside of the right-of-way along here into these commercially zoned properties, which Westport does not own. So a little characteristics of the surrounding properties. To the north, you have it zoned M1, light manufacturing and general business. Those are currently occupied by a single-family home and a farm field. To the east, we have general business and R87, medium low-density residential. Those are both occupied currently by farm fields. To the south is planned development district, which are the future phases 2 and 3, which are under construction for Broadmoor Commons. To the west, we have a zone general business, R20 medium density residential, and PDD planned development district. And those are occupied by farm fields, some of them are vacant, and also single family homes. And so staff came up with a list of possible conditions, the first one being the applicant shall provide acceptable growth habitat documentation for those 2 trees that were mentioned earlier. Second one, Planning and Zoning Commission shall approve a divergence for 50-foot spacing. 3, the applicant shall revise the title sheet of the final development plan to remove the language referring to the old divergence and include the language for the new divergence that they're requesting. And 4, as a response to those revised plans that came in, the applicant shall revise the plans to locate the trees within the public right-of-way along the boulevard entrance adjacent to the commercially zoned properties. And the 5th one being the applicant shall revise the development text to reflect all the changes above. And if you do have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
How big are the trees you're planting? I guess caliper measure is the usual measure,
Typically they go in at a 2-inch caliper.
2-inch caliper,
Mm-hmm.
so not very big,
No,
they will grow.
they will grow, and that's pursuant to code with the 2 inches.
Okay, thank you.
Comments for Jack? Questions for me for Jack? Okay, this time? Okay, thank you, Jack. Mr. Andrews, we're, as you could hear, we're talking about your application now, so, this is your opportunity to make any comments or presentation that you might have. And I'll need to swear you in too. You swear that any testimony you will give in this matter will be the whole truth as you shall answer unto God? Thank you.
My name's Terry Andrews, I'm with Westport Homes. Address is 507 Executive Campus Drive, Westerville, Ohio, 43082. I guess I don't know if you tabled some items tonight or what happened. I thought I had a little time to get here.
Yeah, we only had 2 items and we reversed them.
Oh, okay.
Because we have
okay.
public
All
here
right.
for yours.
Sounds good. But I had read the staff report and everything, and I don't have any concerns of what's being recommended. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I guess the first question would be that last comment, based on your recently submitted plan.
Be able to see it? Because with that, along the boulevard entrance, and we noticed this on the revised plans, which was on the original ones, but we weren't looking for it because that was something we hadn't completely discussed. But along the boulevard entrance into the community, to put them outside the right-of-way would be putting them on the adjacent properties, that it's not your
Right.
property to put them on. So we can't do that. The ones that after you get into the community with the reserves, if they're out of the right of way, that's fine, but we just can't do it along the
Okay.
entrance because that's owned by a different.
Right, but we actually have a landscape easement and agreement with them to landscape on their property. I don't know if you need a copy of that.
Yeah, where was that recorded?
Yeah, that's part of it.
Because there's a utility easement.
Right, there's utility and landscape easement.
Okay,
So
then,
I can give
yeah,
you
we'll need that
copies of that.
provided. That probably should be, and we'll need some information on that because that's the
Okay.
first we've heard of it.
Yeah, because we have an agreement with the adjacent owner to do the landscaping, and then long-term they'll maintain it.
Okay.
But until they develop, we maintain it.
Okay, yeah, we'll need a copy of the
Okay.
easement and the language.
Okay. Commission members? Okay, anything?
No questions.
Jerry?
No, sir.
Gary?
I have none this time.
Nothing? Ann? Okay. At this time, I know we have at least one speaker request from the audience. Debbie Welsh, come forward. And you had 3 items that you wanted to speak about?
Yes.
Okay, first let me swear you in. Do you
Yes.
swear that any testimony will give in this matter will be the whole truth, yes, you shall answer unto God?
Yes.
Thank you.
I was here a couple months ago, you probably remember. Debbie Welsh, I live at 369 Eddington Drive in Pataskala and have a lot, number 33, in Westport, development. house is just now being built. I'm also in charge of, we have a Facebook page that the owners write back and forth with questions, and I try and facilitate that with Josh and some of the contractors that I see. They have 3 questions. One, is when do you think the traffic light will be active? We're having trouble getting out of the development, especially if you're turning left. Traffic, on Broad Street is not easy anyways, to maneuver, and, I was running pretty late getting here because I had to turn right, and traffic was just, was not stopping, was not slowing down, so. Plus there was, 6 deer that ran in front of me that I wasn't expecting. And the other concern or question they have is our neighborhood lights. We have lighting that's decorative in the development that hasn't been activated yet. Some of the owners have been there, they just did their 30-day walkthrough, so they've been there 30 days, but we have decorative lights throughout the development that has not been turned on yet. And then the third concern is, and I don't know if this is something that you can help me with, is Haunted Hoochie. They're open until 3 in the morning. We have families with children going to school. The music and noise is off the chain. I mean, it's ridiculous. And the owners are very concerned about the volume as well as being open during the week till 3 in the morning. Granted, it's closed now, but we're anticipating we'll have even more owners. We're just in phase 1, and there's another 3 or 4 phases after us. And I am one of the lots that are right on the trees. And it's just, I'm just kind of curious, once the leaves fall, how much of Haunted Hoochie am I gonna see? So, that's my questions, from the residents of Broadmoor.
Okay. I'll ask, Scott, do you
Do I
think you
sit
could
down?
address some of those? Or?
No, you can stay there. So from the traffic light perspective,
Yes.
I was able to text
Yeah.
our public service director, and the information I got is when the traffic light was installed, it's not completely warranted at that location, that there wasn't a need for it. So the fire district requires that there be 2 entrance points to a subdivision, one of which can be emergency only. So as part of a compromise with Westport and the fire district, they installed a traffic light because there was no other way to get an emergency access, because the only road frontage that the community has is just Broadmoor Boulevard, so there's no other way that they could get an emergency access in there. So the compromise was reached that a traffic light would be installed so that the fire district would have some control if there was an accident at that intersection to get in and out. So with that, it's my understanding that the traffic light will not be fully functional until close to build out, just because that's the point at which it would be most warranted to have there.
Phase 1,
Of the entire project.
so it's not gonna be active until the entire, and that could be years.
It could be years, but
That'll go like
at the time though, technically, there shouldn't even be a traffic light. So that was the way to, from his perspective, to justify its usage.
Okay.
So it probably won't be till the end. From my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Andrews, but you're working with AEP to try and get those lights on. And Mr. Andrews can probably speak more to that than us, but it sounds like it's just Westport and AEP working together. And then from a Haunted Hoochie standpoint, if they're open late and there's noise, I think that's more of a police matter. There's nothing
The police have been called.
from a zoning perspective that we can do, because that's been around for
20-some years.
yeah, well before the city was established, so it's kind of an existing non-conforming use. So there's, from a zoning perspective, there's not a whole lot that we can do.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Andrews, did you have anything to add on the street lights?
Sure. Our lighting contractor has been in contact with AEP over the last 45 days or more about trying to get the lights hooked up. The wiring's there to the transformers to turn the lights on. The most recent response we received is they had storm damage down south, so a lot of their crews have been relocated. But I would think within the next couple of weeks they'd be activated, street lights, because they've been in there for over 90 days.
Okay, thank you. Just to clarify on the traffic light, the fire district, there was a compromise issue, the fire district, because there was no secondary entrance.
Mhm.
Do they have any control in an emergency situation where they would activate it? Or is it just there and not functioning at all until build out?
It's not functioning at all at this point. I think what the proposal will be is have flashing yellow along Broad and then flashing red at the end of Broadmoor Boulevard. And once that happens, it's my understanding that then the fire district will have control, that if they need to make it all red, they should have the ability to do that. So their concern will be met with that, but in terms of fully functioning with green, that won't be until near complete build out.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I couldn't understand why it would be there and not functioning at all
Mm-hmm.
for emergency use until the end, so, or, till well into build out. Okay, thanks.
So it
David?
will be working then, just not red, white, or red, yellow, and green? It would just be yellow
Yeah, it would be on a flash.
yields.
Yeah, it would be
Yields.
flash with yellow along Broad and then red as you pull out. So essentially it'll function as a stop sign, and then the fire district will then have control at the flashing point, and then closer to build out it'll be fully functional.
Any other comments or questions on her concerns or the residents' concerns?
I have none.
I do have a question about the trees. The trees in the division clarify they're not going to be in the right of way. They're going to be outside of the right of way. Is that right? Or do I have it backward?
We're actually bringing them back into the right of way
I think you
with this plan. The original one was that they'd be out of the right of way.
Okay. So there are sidewalks in the development.
Correct. So the trees as originally proposed, the public service director said no trees in the right of way. I think this was closely after the city had to go through and remove a lot of ash trees, so I think there was a little gun shy, so to speak, on doing that. So there was a compromise and Westport got a divergence to put them on private property, but then with the number of trees, like for that lot 11, there would be 8 trees, and then it became problematic not only with that, and then when the new houses are built, saying which tree goes where. We thought it'd be better for the city, Westport, and the homeowners that we get those into the right of way so that it's easier to work with. Because the new public service director likes them aesthetically, and then from a speeding standpoint, that it'll slow people down when you have the trees there. For the entrance into the subdivision, that if you go down Broadmoor Boulevard adjacent to the commercial properties, and then farther in where you go between the 2 reserves, on those reserves, A is on the left, B is on the right. Those will be outside the right of way, which is fine because it's on reserve property, so that's not an issue. And originally, as we reviewed it, we noticed that the trees to the north there, adjacent to the commercial properties, were moved out of the right of way, which was onto private property. So at that time, we didn't know that Westport had a landscape easement through there that allowed them to do it. So those trees will move out of the right of way, and all the ones that were originally placed on lots will now be in the right of way. So it kind of flip-flopped.
Okay. My only concern with trees in the right of way is root damage. So who would be responsible for damage to the sidewalks or anything in the right of way? Would it be the homeowners, or is it gonna be on the city, or is it gonna be on developer?
It would be a combination of both. The tree itself would be the city's, but if there's damage to the sidewalk, it would be the property owner's responsibility. However, there's a table in the zoning code where they've kind of vetted the trees that can go there to minimize impacts. That you're not gonna put a tree that's gonna have roots that grow out and buckle the sidewalk, or have a taproot that's gonna go down into a utility system, or, for example, Bradford pears were a pretty popular street tree. Those are pretty fragile, so you get a lot of the limbs breaking, so those are prohibited. So when the zoning code was established, it was kind of vetted in terms of what's appropriate to minimize impact. I mean, you can't foresee like with the emerald ash borer what could happen, but
Right.
in terms of impacts to infrastructure, it's been kind of vetted to minimize those impacts.
So if the tree goes bad, we have to replace it because it's in the right of way.
Correct.
If it's not in the right of way and it goes bad, we don't have to replace it.
It would be for example, if it were in a reserve, it would be the homeowners association's responsibility.
So why would we wanna take on responsibility of replacing trees? What's
Well-
the commitment, what's the long-term commitment for replacing these trees? Is it 10 years, 20 years, 5 years? If they're bad, is it 1 year? What's the warranty? Is there a warranty? What is the city guaranteeing?
There's typically a 1-year warranty that if it dies after it goes in, it's to be replaced, but beyond that, it would be the city's responsibility. I don't know, I mean, typically when you plant the tree, they have a landscape company that makes sure it's planted at the appropriate time, it's properly cared for to give it an opportunity to grow. We haven't had, from what I've heard and from the public service department, because we kind of went through them to say, you know, it's required by code, we had issues in the past, are you okay with this? And they said, yes, please do that. So, you know, from the information we're getting, it seems like they're comfortable with putting it in the tree lawns, in the right of way, and that it's not gonna unduly burden the city with maintenance.
I just don't see why it's the general taxpayers' responsibility to pay for trees that are in a private subdivision. That's just my opinion. Of course, that's why I'm here, I guess.
Right.
If we take it out of the right of way, the homeowner has a right just to go and cut it down, right, if he doesn't like it there?
Correct, and that was
So then we end up with no trees.
kind of the thought process, particularly with the number of trees that a homeowner, well, at the beginning, if the house is built, and then planting season comes and someone's lived there, and so the truck shows up with 8 trees, it's like, where do you want them? They're going in your yard. That probably gonna upset the homeowner. Then if, you know, cause it'll be the city's making us do this, then, you know, there's complaints, and then the homeowner says, put it there, and then a week later it's gone. We didn't really accomplish, I think, the intent of the street tree provision, so, so then it's like, arguably, we could end up with no trees. So the thought was let's get them in the tree lawn, so we have them, that's pursuant to code. The only deviation is from the 30 feet to the 50 feet, but that kind of gets it out of the way of driveways and things like that. Driveways, mailboxes, etc.
Also reduces the number of trees too, correct?
It does.
Which reduces the potential burden on.
That is correct.
What'd you say? I couldn't understand. Reduces the burden on.
There's not as many trees, so there's there's less trees that we would potentially have to fix or replace versus 30 foot apart, just adds more trees into the subdivision.
One point that Scott mentioned, the public service director stated as a reason for doing it in the tree lawn is that it would slow traffic somewhat. I don't know what, I don't know what evidence they have, or studies they've got of that. But I guess in a way it does, if a crowd gives you a feeling of it being crowded, it potentially could do that. That's another possibility.
Do we have any information on how many trees the city's had to replace in an instance like this?
Unfortunately, I don't have that now. I think from my understanding, it was mainly the ash trees that when the emerald ash borer hit, that was the vast majority of them, but unfortunately I don't have the information in terms of how many over the years we've had to replace.
And they have a landscaper that will take maintenance for the life of the trees, or who maintains the trees if they're in the right of way?
It would be, the city would be responsible if it's moving over into in the roadway at a dangerous point, the city would be responsible for pruning the trees back.
So that's more taxpayer responsible. I don't know. I just see all these subdivisions going up and just more and more taxpayer responsibility for private use, for private, I don't know, I mean for private subdivision, I don't know. I'm just, that's my concern. There's a lot of, probably have to hire another staff member to start maintaining all of these, and we don't know, I mean, it's for the life of the development that we would be maintaining these trees and replacing these trees, is that right?
Correct. If it's in the public right of way, that's correct.
So if we have trees that are established for 10 years, then we'll be replacing, we could be replacing a sizable tree.
If
We'd have to match it, we'd have to match size, or it would be,
we wouldn't have to match size. We would put it in at the 2-inch caliber.
Like they did on 310.
Mm-hmm.
Other discussion? Yes, two. You've got, yes.
Can I
ma'am.
just say, I understand what she's saying.
Can't hear you, I'm
Oh.
sorry.
I
Could you-
understand,
Sorry.
I understand what she's saying, but you also have to realize my house is over $400,000. And I don't know how many houses he has, but there's a lot. And when you consider, and I have a ranch, so most of them are over, they're like 500,000. That's a lot of money, and that I'm taxpayer. So you have to remember that when you're talking about replacing trees.
I understand that.
Thank you. Yes.
I just want to comment on the concern of the maintenance of the trees. Yeah, I mean, you might check with some other cities. I know Canal Winchester, they're real active with the street tree program. In fact, they have us pay them to install them. And they maintain them long-term, so there's other municipalities kind of dealing with the same thing, but I mean, they encourage the street trees, but they want to kind of control it, so. It probably goes from one side to the other spectrum on how those things are addressed, so. So I just thought I'd share that with you.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other audience comments or questions? Okay, thank you. Okay. Further discussion?
I hear what Ann's saying, but I also think you lose trees if we don't put them in the right of way. So, I mean, it's kind of the question, do we wanna have less trees in the city, or do we want the trees in? I mean, it's a valid argument that Ann brings up. I mean, but like I said, the other side is, they just cut them down. And I've seen developments like that where that's what's happened, and then the developments have little to no trees, which is a concern also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are environmental benefits to having trees there,
Yes.
so, and that really benefits everybody, I guess, one way to put it, unless you're having to rake the leaves.
Yes.
Any other comments?
No, I think the 50-foot interval is actually a good thing compared to the 30-foot. Looking at some of this, I didn't know what these trees were this weekend and this and that, so I looked them up while we were sitting here. I mean, this weekend we'll get 70-foot tall, 50-foot wide. So you got those 30-foot apart, that's gonna be a lot of, and it's just gonna be a wall of green, you know, and it's really hard to differentiate between the two, you know, the separate trees, so I think the 50-foot thing's a good thing. Plus it reduces the amount of trees the city can potentially be responsible for. I think it's kind of a good compromise, honestly.
And if I could, before we go into any potential conditions, cause we have number 4 as a possibility that they need to be moved, it sounds like there is, a landscaping easement through there, so if we could remove 4 and potentially replace it with that the applicant will provide us information as pertains to the landscaping easement. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. That was one of the questions I had, how you would want us to deal with that. I mean, whether we would leave that in contingent upon getting a copy of the landscape plan or so you could address that, so that's good. Thanks. Any other discussion? Are we ready to act on the application tonight?
I'm good. I did have a comment about it looks like the entryway sign that's there is not level. Am I the only one that sees that? Is it me?
I don't know, but I'll take a look at
It looks like it's not level. Do you see that?
Yes.
It's not level, right? It's not like, good. I'm glad it's not just me. So maybe you could address that.
Thank you.
That's all I have.
Or as you drive by, maybe you could inflate the tires on one side of your vehicle to match it.
Right. Just turn this way.
Okay. All right, are we prepared to act on the application then tonight?
Before we do that, let me ask,
Okay.
our presenter, do you have any problem with the modifications they've offered in the report?
No,
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that.
and I can easement over to Mr. Fulton.
Well, let me move then that we approve application number ZON-18-011 pursuant to section 1225.14 of the Pataskala Code with the 4 modifications listed in the staff report on the project, or on the application.
Okay.
So I can think
Was
of,
it 4 or 5 months?
Well, yeah, I was just, did you want to add anything there on the provision of the landscape easement?
sure, how would the language go?
For the applicant to provide landscape easement documentation before trees are replaced outside the easement?
Outside the right of way.
Outside the right of way, I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine, that's a 5th condition then.
It replaces 4.
Yeah, we replaced 4 on the PowerPoint, correct.
So
Second.
You're okay with that, Rick?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine.
All right, so we have a motion and.
I'll second.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
No, we have one, thanks.
Oh, you should, yes.
We're rolling tonight, right? Okay, discussion on the motion to approve with the 5 modifications. No discussion? No. Yes, for roll call vote.
Ms. Rogers?
Yes.
Mr. McGowan?
Yes.
Mr. Epperson?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Truax?
Yes.
Mr. Ripley?
Yes,
Mr. Boggs?
Yes, that motion passes. Thank you. Moving on to the agenda then. We go back to item A, which is rezoning application ZON 18010. This is from the city concerning an amendment to section 521.11, the weeds and other nuisances.
Thank you, sir, and as we move forward with this, I'm thinking maybe we could have just more of a discussion this evening rather than make any action on it, but again, that's up to the commission, but I think maybe it might be best just to use this time for discussion purposes. So section 521.11 prohibits grass and weeds from exceeding 8 inches in height, and this is applicable to commercially zoned properties, so PRO, downtown business, general business, and local business. and it's also applicable to properties 1.5 acres or less in size. So the violation process works as if a property is identified as having grass and weeds over 8 inches in height. The zoning inspector will post a notice on the property indicating that a violation of this section exists. He will also notify the property owner by mail if the property owner is known. If the property owner is unknown, we will publish a notice in the newspaper. The property will have 7 days to correct the violation. If it is uncorrected after those 7 days, the city will have the property mowed. Then a lien will be placed upon the property for the amount of the invoice for the work performed, plus either 20% of the work performed added on for administrative costs, or $200, whichever is greater. And the lien is only approved through council. So after it's mowed, we go to council and say this was done, they approve the lien, then it's taken down to the county and put on the tax roll. The planning and zoning department does it a little bit different. If the property is occupied, so if there's a house that has grass that's over 8 inches in height, we pursue a violation if necessary through mayor's court. We have a multi-stage process. Door hanger, 7 days. Courtesy letter, 7 days. A door hanger would be knocking on the door, explain there's an issue. If no one's home, a door hanger is left saying give us a call. After 7 days, then a courtesy letter goes out. It's a nice letter that basically says you may not be aware, but you can't have grass or weeds over 8 inches in height. After 7 days, if it's not done, we send a violation letter that's a little bit more strongly worded that says, you know, this is in violation, you need to have this mowed, you have 10 days, and if there's no resolution, then it goes to mayor's court. And if there's a repeat problem on the property, next time through the door hanger is skipped, and then the next time through the courtesy letter is skipped, so then it becomes a violation in mayor's court. The reason we don't mow occupied properties is that if we call a landscaping crew to come mow a property and it's occupied, there could be a safety concern with someone looking out their back window and there's a guy on a riding mower cruising through their backyard. So because of the safety concerns, we'll typically pursue mayor's court just so we don't have to then get an officer and go through that. Typically we don't get to a point that it goes to mayor's court. Usually the violation is corrected before it gets to that point. And our process is not punitive. We look more for just following the regulations and not trying to be punitive with what we do. If the property is unoccupied, so we know the house is completely vacant or it's just a vacant lot, we will go through and have the property mowed. Very rarely do we have this happen. We did just have one recently, but it's very rare that we'll actually pursue the violations this way. So the proposed amendment, as I mentioned, existing, it's commercially zoned properties and lots that are 1.5 acres or less. The proposal is to add the addition of industrially zoned properties, property zone planned development district, property zone multifamily residential, property zoned manufactured home residential, and all properties located within a platted subdivision. There was a red line version attached with the staff report, and this did go through Development Committee on September 17th, and they recommended that this proceed through the code amendment process. Part of the impetus of this was we do get resident complaints during the summer months where there are properties that are not covered by the existing grass and weed ordinance that is impacting folks that we have no way to have the property mowed. So we get complaints. There's some properties that it happens every year. They call, we have to explain there's nothing we can do. So this occurs mainly in properties that are over 1.5 acres in platted subdivision. We've had some apartment complexes. So it's become somewhat problematic that we do get resident complaints and we're unable to assist them. So with the existing code and through what the proposed amendments are, you can see the intent was to not, overburden, you know, a rural farm property that we're not gonna go after them if it's 20 acres, it's like you need to mow your grass. I don't think that was the intent, and it's not the intent the way we enforce the provisions. The reason for the changes would be to address those residents' complaints where there's a property that is not mowing their yard, that it's impacting other properties. So our intent is to help residents with their complaints and be able to address those concerns while not going and, you know, impacting properties that are, you know, rural properties that, you know, 5-10 acres that if it's grown up, it's not impacting anyone like it would be if you're in a platted subdivision and the lot behind you is not mowing their yard. And with any code amendment change, following a recommendation from the planning commission, it would move on to city council for consideration. We did not receive any other comments from departments or agencies, and there's no proposed modifications. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
Is there anything in there for federal government buildings that post office?
If it's zoned commercial, we could have it mowed.
They went a long time.
And typically with our code enforcement process, just because of the sheer size of the city, you know, the zoning inspector's out every day following up on things, doing inspections, so if he sees something, he will typically document it and begin the process. Unfortunately, just due to the size, he can't be everywhere, so we do rely on a lot of complaint-based code enforcement, just because if it's out there and it's bothering someone, we're happy to follow up, but, you know, if you're driving by and you can't see it, then there's no way to nip it at that point.
Good question.
The small animal that we did, the small animal, what was the lot sizes? Because my question is, let's say someone has 3 acres and they say they're having free-range chickens. How will that fall, you know, in terms of an argument with somebody, or, I mean, cause I know you pretty much answered agricultural. I'm just trying to think of that in between, scenario we might have.
Well, it wouldn't directly, arguably, I guess if it would be tied to chickens or some of these, depending. So if it's in a platted subdivision, it could fall into that if people have chickens, but it would have to be that the grass or weeds is becoming over 8 inches in height.
I just know in the small animal, we went by lot size, or I remember that, and I was just trying to remember what we
You know, there's different
did with that.
There's different stages, and it's all less than 5, but kind of how it goes that if you're for every, I think it's 10,000 square feet, if you're under 10 for chickens, you get 0, and then beyond that it goes in increments of 10,000 feet and kind of has a sliding scale of the number of birds you can have.
I mean, I don't have a problem, I just wanna make sure we cover ourselves so someone doesn't start barking, I got 2 acres and I got free-range animals on it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just how would we handle that?
Mm-hmm.
Questions over here, comments?
I have none.
Okay, well, I'll bring up the one that came to my mind. We do have a few subdivisions that are platted subdivisions that are larger lot sizes. And that may be an issue, and then if you look at in PDDs, the reserve areas maybe fall into this would fall into this category. And that's, we had a discussion earlier this week, and that's, I think, what led to Scott's comment about maybe we just discuss this tonight and not act on it because we need to do more consideration. Again, that's up to the commission. That's just some specific examples that we could find where maybe the rule would be applied and it wasn't the intent. Now, if you read it, there's a process for an exemption from the city administrator, but that, I don't know that we really define that well I mean, did we figure out how the process, if it's just a verbal request, and how long is that exemption for? I'm not sure that was clear, right?
No, based upon the language in the code, it's not clear that you can apply to the city administrator to request you be exempt, but there's no standards on duration. It's basically open-ended, so he could say, you get 2 years, you get 6 months. It's kind of dependent, so there's no clearly defined, if you are determined to be exempt, what's the time frame in doing that? So
Is that
there's nothing-
information that would have to be put into this?
It probably wouldn't be a bad idea, and also during our discussion, it talks about designated woodlands and other things designated agriculturally, but it doesn't define clearly is it a formal designation by the state, by the city? When we enforce this, if someone has like a wooded lot and there's undergrowth under that, we wouldn't say you need to mow all that. We more view it as if you have a yard.
Flat area.
Yeah, that would need to be mowed, but if it's agricultural, if it's a wooded lot, things of that nature, we typically don't enforce those. We haven't had anybody complain about that there's undergrowth in these woods, make it go away.
And we did find a couple of, just as an example, a couple of reserve areas that were several acres. I don't recall that one was like 20 acres or something, and it's an open field. It appears to be mowed, and they may even be using it for hay, for all I know, but that could be an issue. So that, anyway, that's why there were some concerns there, but maybe we need
How many of those are those? Would those be like exceptions versus?
well, they're not that many.
Commonality.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and in looking, for example, like off Saddle Path, those are large lots. But just kind of doing a quick aerial view, most of those, if they're not wooded, the grass is mowed and maintained. But there was that reserve area that it looks kind of like a horse pasture, but is it being used for hay? Is it a horse pasture? Is it just reserve? I think from a planning department perspective, we could probably add additional language that we clearly define what's a woodland, what's agriculture, perhaps of a reserve, because I know in a lot of reserves, there's language that says it's to be kept in its natural state. So if it's pasture, there's grass, it's intended to be that way. We don't want to then kind of shoot ourselves in the foot and have some of these unintended consequences, because really the goal is to not over-regulate and start to be the grass police, but if there's a property that's impacting others, if you're trying to sell your house and the neighbor won't mow the grass, now would be the time to come in and say we need to mow this, to be able to address residents' concerns. So from our perspective, maybe vetting this a little bit more and trying to find some exceptions or exemptions to be written into this code, rather than saying, well, I know it's a reserve and that's a horse pasture, but it's high. Well, if you apply to the city administrator and give you an exemption, but then how does that work? And then how many exemptions do we get? And then how many, trying to keep track of, they were 6 months, this was 2 years, this was 5 years, and trying to go through and enforce it. I just think it would be very difficult logistically to try and do that efficiently. So I think we wanted to get planning commission's thoughts, but I think from our end, we probably need to maybe expand upon this and determine what exactly would be exempt, what exactly is not exempt, put those in here, and then not have any unintended consequences where, because Mr. Boggs had stated his lawnmower broke 1 year and didn't have an opportunity to get out to mow, so, by that, he's in a platted subdivision that, he could have got a door hanger or violation letter or things like that, and that would not be our intent to start, unduly going after people for something, so any thoughts or feedback? Because I think we probably need to revisit this.
I think defining some of the most common potentials for exemptions would be good, because then that would limit the amount of exemptions that are potentially applied for. And those that are applied for, I think it should be somewhat difficult to kind of have a reasoning why it shouldn't be just because I can't mow this week, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Or, you know, it's too expensive for me to mow that or whatever. I mean, that's the cost of owning property, you know? So, yeah, I agree, like with the horse pastures and things like that, I think the language needs to be clear. But then when you do get to the exemptions, I think we need to make sure that there is, okay, you can have a, you know, 14-day extension or 30-day, whatever, you know, the timeframe is described, but, I don't think that the intent of the exemption should be just to cover somebody that has a lot of property and don't wanna absorb the cost of mowing it.
Without making it open-ended, it might be good to see if there are existing exemption references for other reasons as well. I mean, if there's already something somewhere else in the code that says there's a way to get an exemption from that piece of the code from the city administrator, we probably should use the same process rather than creating another, or documenting another process. I don't know if there is, but that's just something to keep in mind as you're looking through this.
I agree. To my knowledge, there's not another one, but that's a good idea to see if there's one that's already established, and then just, instead of recreating the wheel, just use that.
One thing that we had discussed earlier this week, and I don't know that you mentioned it, Scott, was the intent or the desire to get this in place before the next growing season. So, just as a comment to commission members, this was not, I don't think this would be an open-ended delay, you know, while we go back and spend months trying to figure out all the rules. The way we've kind of mapped it out, I think by the end of the year is what we'll get our piece done. So that it would go through council and be ready before the spring, I guess, basically.
If the amendment came back and there was a recommendation in December, then it would go to council at the end of January, the second meeting in January, February, for the third reading, then the 30 days would put us at the end of March. So,
That's
yeah.
about the limit, yeah.
Timeframes,
And that's if
Timeframe.
they agree with everything.
Right. But I mean, even to have a chance of getting through. Because if we didn't act on it until January sometime, then you know, the grass would already be that high,
Yeah.
above 8 inches by
Yeah.
the time we go into effect.
So we do have some time, but I don't want to put any of us in a situation where it's like, well, we have to do this and get this done, and if we don't do it right, and then we're back changing it again, or, you know, we have a whole season of being grass police and doing something and having some unintended consequences. So I'd rather us make sure we get it right, and if it gets delayed, it gets delayed, but, you know, I don't wanna have anything that we're not intending to happen.
Thank you. Any other suggestions or comments on what we should be looking at to clarify? All good? Then we should formally table this tonight. Kind of seeing all kinds of nods, so I'll move that we table rezoning application ZON 18010.
Second.
Thank you, Rick. Any discussion on the motion to table? Roll call, please.
Mr. Boggs?
Yes.
Mr. Ripley?
Yes.
Mr. Truax?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Epperson?
Yes.
Mr. McGowan?
Yes.
Ms. Rogers?
Yes.
That motion passes. And that was those were the two items on new business. Before we move on, you've been patiently waiting. Did you have any comments in general? Okay. Well, we're glad you're here. Always welcome.
Item 6 on the agenda, other business, we have none listed. Did anything come up since the agenda was published? Guess not. Okay, moving on, number 7, excused absences from the October 3rd, 2018 meeting, Jerry and Ann. So we'll go with Jerry first. Well, we won't put you on the
I'm
spot.
back for
I was waiting for you to say something.
Okay, I'll move that we excuse Jerry from the October 3rd, 2018 meeting. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Discussion? Roll call.
Mr. Epperson,
Yes.
Ms. Rogers,
Abstain.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Truax,
abstain.
Mr. Boggs,
Yes.
Mr. McGowan,
Yes.
Mr. Ripley.
Yes.
Motion passes. Okay, next for Ann. I'll likewise move that we excuse Ann from the October 3rd, 2018 meeting.
Second.
Thank you, Rip. Any discussion on the motion? Roll call.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Ripley,
Yes.
Mr. Truax,
Abstain.
Mr. Boggs,
Yes.
Mr. Epperson,
Yes.
Mr. McGowan,
Yes.
Ms. Rogers.
Abstain.
That motion passes. Okay, item number 8, approval of the minutes, meeting minutes from October 3rd. Everybody have a chance to review the minutes? Are there any additions or corrections?
I did have one, my first ever. In the, at the very bottom of page 2 where it's, Mr. Ripley made the motion, it had me as voting yes.
You didn't?
I wasn't here. That's all, I'm sorry.
We sensed you.
I'm sorry, I did, I was like, I can't believe I'm gonna do it, but I gotta do it.
Any other corrections? Okay, if not, then I'll move that the minutes of the October 3rd, 2018 meeting be approved as amended. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dustin. Any discussion? Roll call.
Mr. Ripley,
Yes.
Ms. Rogers,
Abstain.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. McGowan,
Yes.
Mr. Truax,
Abstain.
Mr. Boggs,
Yes.
Mr. Epperson.
Yes.
That motion passes. Anything else tonight?
Just out of curiosity, why is the next meeting December 12th instead of the 5th?
That's a good question.
That's when BZA is?
I had them
I
backwards.
wouldn't want to miss that. Maybe a little lively action.
We're gonna
Yeah.
do 2 meetings at once and just see how that goes.
See how
So
that
that
goes.
will be
That's
amazing.
fine.
No, that, good catch, it should have been the 5th. It is the 5th.
I was just curious. Thought
We're just
maybe one
keeping you
of
on your
was going to
toes.
Bahamas or something.
It worked.
Anything else?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Okay, we have a
But it
motion
is
to
the
adjourn.
12th.
Second.
What's that?
No, it's the 5th.
Fifth.
The 5th.
Oh, it's the 5th?
Yeah, it will be the 5th. But if you wanna come to BZA, it's as well.
We have a motion on the floor to adjourn, and it's been seconded. Do we roll call.
Mr. McGowan,
Yes.
Ms. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Epperson,
Yes.
Mr. Truax,
Yes.
Mr. Ripley,
Yes.
Mr. Boggs.
Yes. Motion passes, and
So
we're
we'll meet
adjourned.
on the 5th.